Hello and welcome to the Digital Disruption Podcast. Today we are joined by our guest, Tim Ash. Tim, first of all, let me just say, thank you for the gift of your time and for joining us today. We couldn't be more tickled to have you on the podcast. Tim is a international speaker, a published author, an entrepreneur and business founder. And Tim, I'd love for you to give a brief introduction of yourself and what you do.
Yeah. Sure, Patrick. Hey, very happy to be on with you guys. I Going back a ways, I started one of the first digital marketing agencies that focused on what is now known as conversion rate optimization. It was called Site Tuners, and I ran it for about 20 years. So we work with the Nestle's, Google's, Expedias of the world on down to nimble startups and created over 1.2 billion, that's a billion, in documented value for our clients. Along the way, I also wrote a couple of best-selling books on landing page optimization and started the Conversion Conference, which is the first kind of vendor agnostic international conference on conversion rate optimization. Ran that here and in Europe, here in the US, that is, in Europe for about 15 years. And then about 5 years ago, I stepped out of the agency, sold it to business partners, and I've been focusing on keynote speaking all over the world at online marketing events and conferences, as well as advisory for senior executives at companies, where essentially I'm unlimited on call to help them with any marketing stuff. So that I
Great.
think brings us up to the present.
Awesome. And I noticed one shared connection that we might have is, did I understand correctly? You did most of a PhD and then decided to pursue entrepreneurship?
Yes, I'm an immigrant. I was originally born in the Soviet Union in Moscow, and my family emigrated to the US when I was 8. And of course, like most first generation immigrants, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna do what my parents did. So my dad had his PhD, my mom had her master's. So I stayed in the PhD program at UC San Diego for 7 years before punching my ticket and starting my first company. So I never quite got the PhD. I was working on one in neural networks, what would now be called
Okay.
artificial intelligence, but I'm a quitter. I never finished.
Well, I'm ABD in religious studies with a focus in Native American studies, so I noticed that as a shared connection. So,
Right on. Stubborn people of the world unite.
anyhow, well, we're tickled to have you, like I said, and you know, I know one of the big areas of focus, especially in your most recent published work, is really focusing on some of this evolutionary psychology, and I'd love to just get your perspective on, from a standpoint of, let's say, one of the areas we focus on heavily is helping companies kind of understand where they should focus on terms of their capabilities, what they should prioritize, having a
Hmm.
better understanding of really where they should put their eyes and what they should focus on to have an actual impact on their business success. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I would love to get your perspective on what should people be prioritizing from at the end of the day, customers are people. So,
Hmm.
what are the sort of triggers, the fears, the hopes, the desires that motivate people to take action, and what should successful brands or aspiring brands focus on?
Hmm. Wow, that's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to hit on two things that I think are key. One is I think most digital marketers, from what I saw, especially in conversion rate optimization, are very tactical. It's just like stay in your lane. We're doing pay per click, we're doing SEO, we're doing conversion rate optimization. Everyone's doing their tactical fiddling. And in conversion rate optimization in particular, that's driven largely by the tool companies, the A/B split testing tools. So they're talking about things like testing velocity and things like that. And it's just like do more crap, and we have tools to help you do more crap. So I think that digital marketers are just too stuck about on the technology and the latest trends. It's like, okay, I gotta have, my universal analytics set up. I need personalization. Um, Whatever it is, I mean, probably tomorrow will be hologram suppositories. I don't know. That sounds painful, actually. But whatever the technology is, it's not about the technology. If
Right.
you're going to have a durable career as a marketer, I believe you need to focus on the universal stuff. And that means focusing on how to persuade people. Well, if you want to understand persuasion, you should understand psychology. If you want to understand psychology, maybe You should understand how our brains evolved and what they're trying to accomplish from a survival standpoint. So to me, evolutionary psychology is the most foundational level of marketing. And in fact, also of leadership, of personal relationships, of
Yeah.
personal development. So understanding the brain and how we really make decisions is underlies it all. And so I'd say two-thirds of the value that we created when I used to run my CRO agency was based on these durable neuromarketing principles. And neuromarketing is
Mhm.
just a fancy way of saying evolutionary psychology applied to marketing.
Sure. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah. I mean, we see people thinking buying technology is going to solve all their problems. It's been a persistent. I've been in digital marketing since the fall of 1999, so I've seen most of the shiny objects that can come across your desk, and I've never once seen the tool itself
Yeah, the,
change
the
anybody's.
game changer, right? No, it's like
Yeah,
one of the
yeah.
things they used to say in horse racing is you bet the jockey, not the horse.
There you
You know,
go.
so it's like the person using the tools, not the
Yes,
tools themselves that are important.
So really, it's the
precisely.
idea of using the timeless tactics, really, or the timeless approaches more so than well, timeliness here is a factor, but like when we think about historically as marketers, right? Some things are universally true still, and some things hold up really well, right? Like great branding, creating great customer experiences, right? Going into that CRO piece, and I'd want to dive a little bit more on that with you,
Mhm.
Tim, because you said, a lot of people rely on tools specifically to maybe answer questions when some of the best conversion rate optimization or just enhancement of like an experience that I've ever seen is someone just slowing down, taking themselves through their own experience sometimes, right? Like it's really hard for brands to maybe take that seat and think outside themselves. What are some
Mm.
ways that you've done that in the past, or like what are some common follies you see for people having a hard time doing that?
Well, thanks for teeing that up, Sean, because actually you brought up the second thing I was going to talk about. So the first is we're all focused on technology and tactics at the expense of like fundamental understanding of psychology, which is foundational to marketing. But the other thing is no one in your company, and I can say this with almost like 100% assurance, is actually advocating for the needs of your visitors, your customers, your prospects. We have this inside view of reality where, well, here's my
Yes.
campaign, here's my return on ad spend, and all this other internal bullshit. And no one's saying, hey, there's these people showing up. They have problems. They don't give a
Yep.
crap about what we're doing. It might be useful to them as part of their taking away a pain in their daily life, but no one's approaching it from a user-centered perspective. Now, I
Yes.
got that at UC San Diego 40 years ago with one of my professors, Don Norman, who's like the godfather of user-centered design. And we literally used his textbook on that as one of our undergraduate textbooks. But it's just now, 40 years later, people still haven't gotten the fact that you have to think only from your visitor's perspective. So I think that's another
Yes.
massive problem and bias that I see in online
It's
marketing.
huge. Oh, it's huge. We have a friend we were having a conversation with recently, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he has a user experience company consultancy, and he said, he goes into these companies and he says, they're like, well, what are you going to do? Research our website? He's like, I'm not going to do anything. He's like, I want to listen to your phone calls of your support people.
Yeah. So as
I
close
want,
as you can get to the front lines, the
yeah,
better. Like I
yeah,
forget what company, there's a big Fortune 500. This new CEO came in and as part of his walking around first 90 days, he started insisting that every manager, vice president, executive spend 1 day a year in the call center.
yep,
Even if it's not answering calls, it's listening to calls. You
yep,
get an earful. I mean, being on the front lines,
absolutely.
talking to your customer service people, your call center people, even your sales people, they're a lot closer to the problem. And even
Absolutely.
better, go out in the field. A couple of my buddies at a UK conversion rate optimization company would test drive every product of every company they work for. So one of them was like, "Oh, build this garden shed." So the garden shed arrives, they go in the backyard and they try to build the garden shed. I mean,
Right.
that's the level of customer intimacy you want.
I think that goes
Absolutely.
back to I'm a big there's like some quintessential reads. You mentioned one earlier with utility and user base, user focused design. But like Ogilvy on advertising is one of the first books that was handed to me when I started in my marketing career. And there's some basic principles there that again, it's one of those. I think that book was written 50 years ago now ish.
I
And
could
it
see more than
holds
that
true.
even,
His big thing
yeah.
was like, we work with Jaguar. I drive the Jaguar. Like I can't build good messaging or support a product the proper way if I don't understand what it's providing a consumer.
Absolutely. I'll go one step further. Some of the best marketing copy my former agency ever wrote wasn't written by us. We would just take direct quotes out of customer service stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, why wouldn't I use the language of your customer the way they're describing their problems and what they care about? So,
Mhm.
absolutely, get again as close to the customer as possible, not just lip service to that. Because we live in a bubble. We live, well, even if it's virtual, you're dealing with your marketing team. You're dealing with your operational stuff. You're dealing with your punch list, what's on your, Asana checklist, and what are you scrumming and pivoting to do next in your stand-up meeting. I mean, it's all, pardon me, bullshit, inside out view again.
Yeah. So taking it from this perspective of the consumer as a person, right, and their kind of mentality, their psychological makeup, their trigger. It, ultimately, successful brands are creating desire and a sense of need and
Mhm.
persuading somebody that they need need or want something enough to part with their money for it, right? And uh, I guess what do you, from your perspective, on the psychological side of things, what do the most successful brands do that other
Hmm.
brands fail to do?
Okay, well, I'm going to attack that in two ways. One is which end you approach it from, meaning general or specific, and then the other is just generally what are good brand building strategies. So the first comment I want to make is, a lot of people lean into, for example, personalization. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So if I can take a 10% segment of your visitors and double its performance, through really, really targeted personalization. That's possible, and that's great. And I'll get you a 5% overall revenue lift. Okay, cool. Or I can take 100% of the people coming through, use a general tendency that all human beings have, again, going back to neuromarketing, and raise that by
Mm-hmm.
5%.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to have the same impact,
Mm-hmm.
5% increase in revenue.
Yep.
Net
So you can
5% either side of it. Yeah.
yeah, and so the way that I approach it, generally what I tell my clients to do when I'm advising them is start with the basics. Start with maybe they're just slight nudges or improvements across a much wider percentage of your visitors. Get that stuff right. And then
Mm-hmm.
on top of it, you can start personalizing and looking for mining veins of gold that you can, really increase the performance of much smaller segments. So I think
Sure.
that a lot of people, they want to run before they can walk or even crawl or flop
Yeah.
around on their bellies. Get the belly flopping part right, okay, which is the
Yeah.
neuromarketing.
Do you think some of that issue aligns or comes from like heavily segmented businesses? Like I've been in the room with some large companies, Fortune 500s, where the way that the business is set up, like those swim lanes, we talked about this earlier, and people trying to stay maybe in those too much sometimes, or being maybe afraid to cross the line, not cross the line from a like a rude or like a malicious intent, but like, hey, you're seeing this. I'm an organic. We're seeing this. Are we seeing the same thing? Is there something aligned there? And can we take that maybe to design to our testing team? And is there something that we can universally test here? Like, is that does that happen because of
Yeah,
that
a lot of it
segmentation
has to
or
do with these kind of silos or the tactical fragmentation, like you're describing. But I think mainly it comes from a misunderstanding of where CRO belongs. I used to work with Expedia, and they had a senior vice president who was running all their optimization stuff, and he reported to the president of Expedia. That's the right level to have
Mhm.
business optimization, growth marketing report. If it's
Yeah.
just a tactical level buried inside of a large enterprise, then they're going to have to say, oh, I have to stay within my brand
Right.
guidelines and style guide, and I can't touch this page because of,
Right.
or IT can't get to it for 6 months because it's not on the roadmap and all these other little bullshit
yeah, the
constraints.
the
So you
politicking
really
to
need
move
kind of
that up, right?
yeah, you need air cover at a high political
Mhm.
executive level so you can take a wrecking ball to some stuff that
Yeah.
needs to be, that needs breaking.
Sure. I think there's also a point of like certain company maturity. I mean, Expedia, obviously at this point, they're very well established. But there's a certain dangerous point, I think, of company maturity too, where I'll have had these conversations over the years, and it's like, wait, you want to talk to me about like what advanced modeling you can do, but you're like, are you sufficiently sure you have a product or service that somebody is worth somebody
Yeah,
spending
yeah.
their money
There's
on,
there's
right?
other
Are you,
issues, and
or
a
right?
big part of it has to do with measurability. Again, this is the
Yeah,
tool bias that I often see, which is
yeah,
what gets measured gets done. That truisms. But it's also like that the old joke about the drunk guy crawling around under a street lamp, and the cop comes up, goes, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing here?" He goes, "I lost my car keys. I'm trying to find them." And the cop says, "Well, where'd you lose them?" And the guy points to the dark end of the alley, 100 feet away. He goes, "Over there." And the cop says, "Why are you looking here?" And the guy says, "'Cause the light's better." It's
right.
kind of like that. We can shine some data, we can shine some tools on certain stuff, so that's what we end up optimizing. But some of the best work that my former agency did was, for example, doing informal usability testing, going out into the field like we talked about, and just seeing what a client's life is like and where this fits into it. Another thing we did is like they asked us to improve their website performance. They sold really high-end, expensive stuff. Uh, and their phone people really knew a lot about the products, but they hadn't even had basic sales training. So we spent 1 week, we went over there, we trained 60 sales reps in basic sales training techniques, and their website conversion rate didn't move at all, but their phone sales jumped 15%. And that was
Sure.
multi-millions to them.
Yeah, of course, that's a huge win.
So,
Yeah,
so to
that's
me, I look at optimization again as a much more strategic thing that no, I'm not going to just stay on a landing page and infinitely split test it. I want to be able to go into your email sequences, into your business model, into, we had one RV reservation company, huge company. They expected you to do a 17-step online reservation. And we're like, no, no, it's got to be a two-step pre-registration, and the rest of that paperwork and the upsells happen in person when they're coming to pick up their RV. Completely changed their engagement model. So to me, that's what conversion rate optimization is. It's not just silly testing of button colors.
no, it makes sense to me. It raises a couple questions for me in terms of, I mean, one, I mean, part of your what you said earlier about the Expedia experience answers this a little bit, but I'd love for you to elaborate on it, which is when you're faced with the whole business, as your sort of blue sky to make
Hmm.
improvements on, how do you take that and then turn it into something that is properly strategic, prioritized? How are you in advance of recommending changes, saying, okay, these are the areas that are likely to have the most impact on this client's
Hmm.
business?
Well, look, and by the way, I don't mean to make it sound like I'm anti-testing, which I'm not.
Yeah, yeah.
Certain things you can quantify them, great. That's one of the advantages of internet marketing compared to other forms of marketing, right? Everything's infinitely measurable. But typically, when we go in and we would set up a testing program, we would do it like this. Look, figure out what you can and should be testing. And there are criteria for that, both in terms of potential impact, resources required, opportunity cost, all of that. And you have to have an intake system that takes you through that, as well as champions that will champion each initiative. Somebody has
Yep.
to own it. Then there's stuff below that, which is just do that shit. You don't need to test an increase in the unreadable size 4 font in your footer. Just make it more
Right.
usable. Okay, change the
Right.
font. I mean, there was a famous case of a creative director at Google quitting because they were testing the RGB setting of the blue on the button.
Right.
And you know why they did that? Because they had
Right.
enough traffic at Google, of course, one of the few
But Tim,
places
if
to
it's
actually do
slightly
that.
darker, if it's just even a hint
Yeah.
bluer, we
Yeah,
think we're going to increase conversion by
right.
0.5%.
Yeah, that's
Right.
pretty interesting.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's to settle bar bets. That kind of stuff just shouldn't be done.
Right.
And so you have the just do it pile, the let's test it pile, and then you have strategic initiatives. And the reason and the mistake most companies make is they don't have a lane for each of those. For example, no matter how much polishing the turd or putting lipstick on the pig, whatever analogy you want to use, in your within your current broken website, and however much you can improve that by split testing individual pages, at some point, let's say in e-commerce, you're going to have to redesign your whole information architecture or your whole checkout flow.
Yeah,
And
of
guess what?
course.
Or in the case of most websites, make them more user-centered and role-based and task-based. Well, that's
Right.
a whole site redesign.
Yeah.
And there's no way to get there from here. And so you should be tweaking your site right now tactically to get more juice out of it, but know that you're going to completely reset the goalpost and redesign it as a strategic initiative. And often those collide. We can't
Oh,
do a full
absolutely.
site
Yeah.
redesign because we're not done with our tests. Well, yeah, you're still testing the crappy old site.
We
Somebody should
haven't
have the
planned for
vision to
budget on
design
this,
the
but
new
Yeah.
one.
our site's been fine for 8 years. Like there's always something that gets presented as a blocker to moving an initiative forward like that. And it's
Right.
often like, well, if we can prove some of this out, right? A lot of the job for marketers tends to be then, well, let's build a business case for this, right? Let's work with that sponsor. Let's work with, who we can internally to champion that. It's still a lot. Like I worked at an agency where we never, and we had 50 plus clients in a very specific industry, essentially like home services. Um, Reaching stat sig on a test was near impossible, but we
Hmm.
knew heuristically, and when we started to aggregate these findings across clients with similar customer needs, service offerings, all that, we could start to build some really strong heuristics that drove a lot of our recommendations. And I say that because I think a lot of people then that piece of staying siloed, or maybe even like getting beyond what's inside their four walls and
Hmm.
seeing what's working. I guess, how often were you leveraging more heuristical based, a lot from the psychological standpoint, it sounds, but when working with a group like Expedia, where they have infinite amounts of customer data and they have, they can reach stat sig pretty quickly. How often were you having to put a pause on things and maybe say, hey, look at what your competitors are doing as well. Do we think this is a good experience? And are we worried that we're trying to be too much like them, or maybe not enough sometimes?
Okay, so just even in the language you're using and significant statistical significance and things
Yeah.
like that, null hypothesis. If I throw up a little in my mouth every time I hear that stuff because it's just like as if we're purists and the data is going to tell us everything. Let's get real. Split testing is based on statistics. It's based on the assumption that you have a single population that never changes that you're randomly sampling from. Those are both bullshit assumptions. That's the probability that underlies statistics. Okay, that's what
Right.
it requires you. We randomly sample and draw a new visitor to our site and see what happens. Well, the fact is your marketing mix is changing all the time. The traffic
Right.
mix. Okay, you're changing it by
Right.
messing with keywords or buying new display ads. So it's not the same people or the
Yeah.
same population coming through. And then
Right.
it's not the same population. I mean, you could have a travel site but the people in the winter from the Midwest that are booking trips to Florida are not the same ones
No.
that are in the summer in Phoenix trying to have a nice vacation in Seattle. Okay, they have completely different needs. They're different seasons, and they live in a different place in a different demographic and psychographic.
Yeah.
So you can't have super clean stuff, and relying too much on the data is requiring a crutch to do things. Um, and also there's this, if you actually look at all the tests, like, well, here's the annualized value of this test, right? We'd make 2 million more based on our, the fact that it is 95% significant. Actually, most people are ignorant of what they're saying. You can say, we are 95% certain that what we found is better,
Yeah.
and you can say it looks like a $10 million a year lift as a result of this. You can't say both. That's
Right.
not
Right.
what
Right.
the statistics work. Basically, you can only say that I think we found something better because if you actually stacked up all the alleged wins of every test you've ever done, your company should be 10x what it is right now. And it's not.
No,
So the
for
only thing you
sure.
can look at is your real top line numbers. Are you
Yeah.
improving things? Are you improving profitability, margins, whatever? So I think a lot of, like I said, just to go back, a lot of this kind of reliance on testing and data is largely bullshit.
Yeah, we see it on the media, paid media dollar side of things constantly, right? You have all these competing approaches, MTA and media mix modeling and all. I mean, and they all do serve a purpose. But if you think they represent reality and that you can, reliably say that you're getting the impact that you think you do, like in a definitive sense, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
sure.
well, I'll give you a perfect example of extreme seasonality. So we worked once with a large flower site. Okay, they 1-800 flowers, and they have very different behavior. Their biggest holiday is Mother's Day, and
Sure.
leading up to it, I mean, there's people I know people like this that like January 2nd, they're buying flowers for Mother's Day because it was on their calendar. Okay. And then there's people like me that are like, oh, do you have Saturday delivery? Because Mother's Day is always on Sunday. I'll pay extra for that. Okay. And I'm ordering
Same.
within the last few days because I forgot about it. And then I saw it on the news. And so the behavior of those folks is very different. You have this surge in demand right before the late people like me, the poor planners. And so you can run a test during that time period and hopefully learn something, but you can't apply it for the next 50 weeks.
Yeah,
You can
sure.
only apply that knowledge the next time that cycle rolls around,
Yeah, right. Yeah. No,
just
that's
How
before
do you
Mother's Day.
institutionalize that and surface it correctly again? Because and then if you're running, 100 tests a year, like where does that get buried? And are you
Right.
coming back to that properly? Which
Yeah.
we know
well,
happens.
all, and even in a non highly seasonal business, right? Like almost every test is plagued by the selection bias of like the 80/20 rule, which is like your most active and engaged repeat users are going to see that like your
Yeah, yeah,
variant.
yeah. So that's right. So that so another assumption of split testing is these people are unpolluted by prior communication with you. So
Right,
you actually have to
right,
filter out your frequent
right.
buyers. You
Yeah,
only have to take fresh meat, as it were, that are coming
yeah,
in from your acquisition channels. You can't, if you sent an email or you had someone register for an account, you can't use those people in your tests. It
yeah,
has to only be with brand new traffic. So there's
yeah,
so many kind of flaws with how testing is done that it's almost beyond saving in my mind. So to answer your question, Sean, I think you really should lean much more into the qualitative insights. I think, just because you can't measure it doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it or do it. And most of those should be client facing. So there's that double bias again.
yeah,
I love that. No, I think I we fight this a lot, right? We as an agency, our bread and butter is let's look into the data, but having maybe that willingness to pull at the thread a little bit and unravel the sweater, uh, as I like to
yeah.
say with some people, it pays off. It
Uh,
you can find something of interest and something that is like significant that you would not have seen in the data if you were just looking at it, in a slide deck on a monthly, right?
Yeah, my friend Steve Krug, he wrote probably the seminal book on just good basic website design, and the title of it decades ago was called "Don't Make Me Think."
nice.
It's a
Yeah,
great title, and
absolutely. Yeah.
he's a huge fan of informal usability testing. He says you don't need big focus groups or statistically significant groups of people. You need to find 3 or 4 people that are, not insane, and they don't have to fit your demographic. Go ask your
No,
mother-in-law, okay, and
yeah.
use her and say, hey, you have 30 seconds. You're looking at this website. What are you
Can you
thinking?
make a purchase?
Yeah.
Let's
Exactly.
see
Yeah, I
it.
agree. I couldn't agree more. I want to go back to something you said, not to harp on this Expedia example, but again, it just provided some good food for thought, which is, okay, when you talk about the different swim lanes, right, of like, yeah, okay, if something's broken, if you got broken shit, just fix it because you're providing a bad experience for people. Like, you don't,
Yeah.
right, just
Yeah.
fix it. Some of what you talked about is kind of like at the sort of, if we were thinking from the digital maturity lens, like it's kind of more like digital transformation and stuff, right? Where org change, like, so where you do need, and you're talking about when you were, you're reporting to the VP, right? So it's just for a minute, let's kind of unpack that whole box, right? There's certain level of things you can do at the level of product, right? Fix broken things, et cetera. Incorporate feedback about bad experiences, et cetera. Do a better job training your sales, phone people. But then there's a layer of changes, like you need to re-architect your website. You
Yeah, this is
need
what I
to,
call the strategic projects.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So these strategic projects, how how critical is executive sponsorship to the success of those initiatives?
Well, obviously it's critical because there's significant resource investment, timelines, and high risk attached to them. So one of the things you have to figure out as an agency, if you're like you guys are an agency, like I used to run one, is what's the risk tolerance of the clients? That's something we figure out right away before we even engage with them. It's like, you know what? You're a little too corporate. You're a little too rigid. We won't be able to get anything done. We're both going to be disappointed. Have a nice life. So,
Yeah.
that we did that a lot because some companies just based on their scale or their industries, they just can't,
Yeah.
or the brand Nazis within the company rule. One time we were working with Texas Instruments, which is a large legacy company, used to make
Right.
refrigerators, among all kinds of other things. And they gave us a 180-page style guide for doing testing on their homepage.
Oh
Like
boy.
what fonts, how close to the logo, how much white space around them. I mean, that level of anal retentiveness, which is great if you're a large organization and you need to maintain standards, but it
But
basically
what are
makes
you
it
open for
impossible.
testing at that point?
Huh?
180
Yeah.
pages of what I
Yeah,
can't
that's
do, or here's what
interesting.
it
Yeah.
is. That doesn't feel like to
Yeah, well,
me
it was
play.
layout on the homepage, it was wording and things like that, that we were able to test. But one of the things we like to do, for example, is to radically change the visual priorities of things on the page. What's important? Something's a beacon that needs to be emphasized. Something is a distraction or a booger, like a flashing graphic or something, you need to get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you can't radically control the level of attention on the page, if everything is basically bland and the same, then that's fighting with one hand tied behind your back, and that's
Absolutely.
effectively what was happening through the brand guidelines. But that brings me back to Sean to the answer the second part of what you asked, which is or sorry, Patrick, I think it was you, how brands can be more effective, right?
Yes.
And there are some fundamentals that I think are really easy for companies to do, but they choose not to. And one of those is a combination of brand voice and origin myth. So this is foundational stuff that I start in every one of my advisory engagements. If your company was a person, what three adjectives would you use to describe them? If I ask most companies that, none of them can answer that question.
Yeah.
So, like Patrick, if let's say you're like eclectic, funny, and direct. Okay, how's that? Am I in the
Sounds
ballpark?
good.
I think you
Yeah,
hit that
sure.
pretty well,
Yeah.
knowing Patrick for as
Yeah.
long as I
Okay,
have.
right. So, Sean, like, directed, I'd say curious and intense.
Yeah, I
Again, I
would
don't
say
know you
that.
that well, but okay.
Yeah.
Tim, you're good at this. People should pay you to do this.
Yeah. And this is just picking up just from our, very limited interactions. We have met once before at a conference recently in San Diego, but still, the point is, if that resonates, when I said that about you, it resonated for you, it resonated for the other person that knows you, right? And
Yeah.
Yeah.
in this, you have the same power with a brand voice. And so how you say things is really, really important. And instead, we all default to this, either marketees, this we are the world's leading solution for kind of crap, or corporate speak. And both of them are
Right.
just neutered and useless and sound like every one of your competitors. So
Yes.
instead, what if every visual that came out of your company, every email subject line, every menu naming words you use, everything was like, oh, that's those guys.
Love
That
it.
is their
Yeah.
brand. Like I see it, I feel it. Well, the brand, and it aligns with my desires, my
Yeah,
like
well,
what
maybe
I
that's a
identify
second thing. We'll talk about that separately, okay? But the point is, it's like this distinctive thing, being
Yeah.
unique in the way you say things. And again,
Yeah.
that goes across every touch point. So if you haven't done that foundational work of what's our brand voice, you have to work 10 times harder or pay for traffic.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you don't have to. And to come back to what you just said, that brand voice is going to be really polarizing. Some people are going to go, oh man, these guys are clowns, or man, those guys are too intense, or they're not for me. And there'll be other people that'll go, wow, where have you been all my life? That's exactly what I've been looking for. You're my tribe. I'm going on your crusade. Right.
I
And
think that's really interesting because yeah, you see that a lot with brands who maybe are afraid to lean into maybe some of those strengths. I would call it a strength, right? Like if you have a differentiator or there is something in your brand voice and tone that does make you different, and it may be a little polarizing, but like going back to the 80-20, is that polarizing for the 80 or is it polarizing for the 20?
Well, so to use a political analogy, so in the U.S., the way we decide our presidential elections is not by popular vote, as you know, it's this electoral college, which means a few swing states are the only ones that matter, and within those swing states, the only people that matter are the independents, and I don't mean the 30% Republicans, 30% Democrats. It's not really 40% independents because most people still vote one way or the other within the independents. It's maybe 5%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
10 to yeah, at
Five to
best.
Yeah,
10
the truly
max,
swayable voters.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's 5 to 10% of people in about 7 states that really
yeah,
matter decide every U.S. election. And so when you're talking, you should be pissing off the conservatives. You should be pissing off the liberals because you're only talking to that 5 to 10% of people in only
yeah,
addressing them in the markets where they matter too. And
yeah,
that's how you should think of your brand. If I'm not ignored or hated or dismissed by most people, then I don't have a brand because you
Am I
can't build a
considered?
Sony or a Disney or a Coca-Cola type brand. You can't
yeah,
be everything to everyone, unlike those companies. You have to have really niche, fanatical loyalty, cult-like loyalty within whatever your niche is. And the
hmm,
only way to get that is to have a strong brand voice and a powerful origin myth, usually in the form of the hero's journey, that says this is the trials we overcame, and this is why we do what we do, and we're really passionate. Follow us. You have to have that kind of cult-like loyalty if you're going to be successful as a brand, and that means get more niche, get more specific, get more uh, polarizing. Because you have to stand for something, you have to exclude whatever you stand against. So you have to make real clear distinctions. We are not this.
yep, yep,
We are for this audience or that
I,
Yeah,
audience.
we are
Yeah.
for this and we're against this. That's just
yeah.
human nature. And now we're going back full circle to evolutionary psychology. But we evolved to be in tribes, and most of the other tribes we faced were dangerous to us and unpredictable, and they could enslave us or kill us or assimilate us. And so we had to be really loyal to our tribe and really clear about what we're not.
One of the interesting things on the social side of that we see with the growth of like influencer marketing, for example, like in the outdoor industry, the phony baloney sensor is the meter for that is really high, and the most kind of actually influential influencers are like people that kind of embody that focal point of the brand, right? They're people who really do use the products like out in the field, like in the outdoor industry is a perfect example, right? Like the guys who are perceived or the women who are perceived as, really successful fishermen, hunters, whatever, that actually use these products, they carry a lot of weight, right? Whereas the kind of phony baloney, like pay for play kind of, that just gets,
Yeah, let me unbox your product kind of
yeah,
bullshit. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but also, but brands can be in the same industry and address different tribes. For example,
I agree.
I was gonna say with like
REI, if
Coca-Cola.
these are, Birkenstock wearing hippies that want to save the
Yes,
planet and,
yes.
are against global warming. I can predict a lot of things about the REI shopper. Whereas same industry, Bass Pro Shops, let's go kill us some deer while wearing camouflage. Okay, there's still, they're people that love the outdoors, care about the
Yep.
outdoors, but I can promise you it's a very different
Oh,
demographic.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah, so but
100%.
you see the clarity when I say those two brands, they know what they stand for and what they don't. You have to
Absolutely.
decide, and the more um, kind of black and white and cartoonish and simple you make that, the easier it is to transmit that cultural package and that branding.
Well, I was gonna
No,
say
that's really sound advice.
mention
Yeah.
well, you mentioned like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, like so brands that are large enough then on that horizontal and vertical integration scale where then they start creating sub brands or labels within their brand, right? Coca-Cola, you
Mhm.
have the Diet Coke fanatics, you have a Coke Zero, like Diet Coke versus Coke Zero. Those like there's a debate that happens culturally amongst something as simple as that. And then there's it's not Coca-Cola, I think it's Pepsi, but like the Mountain Dew, right? And like a Mountain Dew customer where we Patrick and I both worked for someone, and it's one of the most intelligent things I'd ever heard from a marketing lens, and I think it plays into this tribalism and kind of what you're talking about on some of the regionality that exists. All marketing is hyper local if it's good, because there is something like localized, whether it's to the individual or to that tribe, that town, or like that demographic that speaks to them, that influences buying and decision making. And so I'm saying this with the lens of like, I have a friend who works for Pepsi, and they're very in tune actually with like, our Mountain Dew customer is, yes, it's a young guy playing video games. Like, we know that they eat that up. They're also in Seattle. They're in places that don't get a lot of sunlight, like, because there's a lot of caffeine. And then they start building out these extensions of the brand that can help, even like, I don't want to say tribalize, but like influence to a deeper extent, to that next level.
Yeah, yeah. So
Buying
think about it
behavior.
this way. Most companies think that whatever they're selling is the center of their customers' world. It's not. You have to actually go where the center of gravity is for that tribe, okay?
Yeah.
And care about all the things that they care about. For example, right now I'm working with a coffee shop equipment supply company. They sell the kind of high-end espresso machines that a new coffee shop would use or something like that. And one of the strategic initiatives we're looking at is the possibility of creating some kind of like, you know, success for coffee shop owners website, because
Yep.
buying the equipment is one tiny little step
Right.
in that process. But what if you really care about your customers, you should be caring about their success. And that
Yeah.
means all aspects of running a coffee shop. And if they create a content-centered site, that would become a really good center of gravity where those people actually live. And then the presumption is, of course, when I'm buying equipment, I'll buy it from you because you sponsor the site. Well, you really run the site, but
Absolutely.
that's a minor nuance. So you see the point. You have to go where the center of gravity is and figure out what people really care for, because it's not the transactional little, you
Of course.
separating them from their money that they care about.
No,
It's
of
not that
course.
moment. It's not that little bit.
Yeah, and I guess it's a different question if you're trying to truly build a brand with some of these intangible kinds of equity and things that we talk about versus a commodity, right? And or if you're trying to build a marketplace where you can sell everything to everybody and ultimately compete on price, and you're trying to get as many eyeballs as possible, or are
Well, you
you?
can't compete on price. I mean, that's a race to the
Yeah.
bottom. Guess who won that race? Amazon already won
No,
it.
of course,
Amazon.
no,
Walmart
of course.
already
That's what I
won it.
And
mean.
they
Yeah,
would tell you they sell
most.
convenience, right?
That's
They
what I'm
don't
saying.
sell.
Most companies are not trying, who really are aspiring to do something. They're trying to build an actual
New
brand with
brands are
some.
tiny. They don't have the
Yes.
time or the money to build a broad-based brand back to your Coke or Pepsi level stuff. I mean, that
Yep.
takes, hundreds of millions of dollars
Yes.
and decades to do. And
Yes.
that's and the advantage of those companies, Sean, you're saying like the Amazon is actually what selling convenience, not price. I mean, they're selling both, but
Yeah.
it's to get to that monopoly status. They have a whole ecosystem. Once you lock that in and
Exactly.
you are a monopoly, you have all kinds of advantages. And then you're just
Correct.
fighting internal inefficiencies,
Of
kind of
course.
leaning against those you have network effects that help you and internal entropy that's fighting against
Right.
you, and you're balanced right there, and that determines
Yeah.
how big you can get. But for new businesses, you don't have any of that. So you can invent your origin myth, you can invent your brand voice, and you can make it much clearer. If you're trying to sound like the big guys, big mistakes.
Oh
Like
yeah,
there's
for
a in the
sure.
rental car industry, what the number one rental car company is? It's
I
Hertz.
mean, my gut wants to say Hertz, but I feel like
Yeah, it is
Sixt or
Hertz.
somebody like that is number one. I don't
No,
know.
no, no. Hertz is number one by far. And so their competitor, I mean, this is decades ago, was Avis. And so they think they're still number two. And Avis's tagline was, "We're number two.
Right.
Try harder."
Yeah, I remember
That was
that.
their
Yeah, that's a pretty
tagline.
good campaign, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great campaign. It's like, and so you were talking about Mountain Dew. I mean, the largest colas are Coke, Pepsi, and what's the third one?
Or saying cola specific, we're going in. Is it RC? Does RC even
Well,
exist
well,
right
that's
now?
exactly. You have to really reach, right? It's like
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
who remembers number three? And so what it is actually in terms of sales, it's Seven Up. And how do they brand themselves? The
The
Uncola. They're
Uncola,
white. They're
right?
clear,
Yeah.
right? They're. This is a fantastic book, by the way. You're talking about classic marketing books. Reese and Trout have this book called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, and it's about positioning.
Yeah.
It's like the Bible on positioning. Really thin book, fantastic. But they say you have to own a segment. You have to be number one, the gorilla, or maybe number two or three, the chimps, All the other monkeys, they don't make any money.
Yeah.
So if you're not, when Jack Welch took over GE many years ago, he came in to knock some heads together and he said, look, here's what's happening. Within the next 18 months, you have to show me a plan to be number one or number two in your sector, or we're selling you. That's it. Because if you're not number one or number two, no one remembers you. So if you want positioning, you have to own a category. Now, how you define that category is completely up to you and can be very
Sure.
niche.
Yep.
Sure.
But you have to own it. Otherwise, you're just not ever going to be remembered. Like you say, RC Cola, what's that?
Right.
Remnant of the past.
Exactly. Because they weren't number one or number two.
Yeah. No, I mean that niching down is a really, I think it's a great, right? It's a proven tactic for on the B2B side of things. If you offer services and consulting, niching down, focusing on specific verticals, industries, having a, you have a very interesting, business model of how you consult and advise. So I think, the different ways people niche down and it, certainly on the consumer facing side of things. I mean, Toomey luggage, right? A 22-inch Toomey carry-on, costs you $695. Well, you can also buy a 22-inch wheel away that costs $29. They've obviously created this premium brand, niche over the years, focused on a certain kind of a consumer. And
Yeah, yeah, and like you say, this could be done with intangibles and services. So yeah, to talk about how niche my advisory service is, here's a an example. It is not a fractional CMO with any operational responsibilities. It's not a consultant that's going to do project-based work for you. It's strictly advisory. You can have
yeah,
unlimited access to me for you and anybody else attending the meeting. If it's important enough for you to be there, I'm there. And I have a wide open calendar, 9 to 5 Pacific time. Just put time on the calendar, right? And it's for senior executives or heads of divisions that are in the 10 million to $100 million a year range because they can still get stuff done and they don't have all this corporate enterprise level inertia that I frankly don't want to deal with and would frustrate
sure,
all of us, right? And so that right there is a very niche definition of a professional service, right?
absolutely.
And
Yep,
you have to get
absolutely.
that specific.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sound advice if I've ever heard any for sure. uh, I guess on the to tease out a bit of the conversation around executive sponsorship. You mentioned sort of like clients that aren't a good fit. I don't, and I'm not. I don't really want. I don't want to think about it necessarily from the business provider standpoint, but in the same, I want to consider that point from the perspective of a company, a brand, an organization. Those things that potentially make them a bad client, right, for a consultant or an advisor trying to help build their capabilities, do large organizational change. Like, what are those? Like, whether it's legacy technology lock-in or just broken processes, but like, what are the things that make meaningful change, impactful change difficult for
Well, oh,
organizations?
I've got hundreds of examples of that from my decades in the agency business. So I'm sure a lot of these will be familiar to you. We already talked about one of them, which is the brand Nazis, the people that just insist on very rigid application of established branding procedures and treatments. Another one is the wrong people owning the things you need to be able to work through. So if you're trying to change the
Mm-hmm.
website, which is a marketing function, but it's owned by IT, who's
Yeah.
got a 6 to 12 month backlog and not enough resources. That's not going
Always.
to work. We once worked with a company that had the marketing department report to the COO.
Okay.
That's not
Interesting.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so hey,
No.
should have been a red flag. We got out of it pretty quickly. Another one is that complete risk aversion.
Mm-hmm.
At the management level, like everybody's just a sheep and they're afraid to make any decisions, and everything's done by committee and through several layers of approval. And for certain businesses that makes sense, but not ones we want to work with. It doesn't make it any very fun to do.
Can I
Another is
pause you on
highly
that one real quick?
regulated.
Can I
Sorry?
pause you on that one real
Sure,
quick on the
sure.
risk aversion one real quick? Just because I think one of the things that we sometimes fail to articulate for our clients is the risk of doing nothing, and sometimes the risk of doing nothing is really in certain industries or in times of rapid change, the risk of doing nothing is huge, right?
Yes, yes.
And so so those kinds of paralyzed organizations that can't take action because of that risk aversion, they're very vulnerable.
That's right. So there's the way I describe marketing in general, and this is like based on a very important tendency of our brain, which is to conserve energy. The 3 pounds of your brain burns about a quarter of your resting calories every day. It's a huge energy expenditure. We have to sacrifice parts of our digestive system, make our muscles weaker, a bunch of other stuff, just to be able to have that kind of brain. We're unique in that way. Well, that means that the brain's mostly on autopilot because if you actively think, that costs more calories, and that active thinking might lead you to move, and that costs even more calories. So you
Right.
basically, the default of the brain is do nothing.
Okay.
So if you think about it, like a car going along on a road, and then it hits a pothole, it goes bump, goes down and then up. That transient event is how you should think about marketing and persuasion. In other words, my default is do nothing. You have to perturb me in order to get me to do something. And that means using negative stuff, the pothole, and the positive stuff, the rebound. And that scale from the bottom of the pothole to the top of the rebound, that's how much it's worth for me to solve my problem. That's how so your job as a marketer is to create enough pain and pleasure and the contrast between them. Like, here's the pain if you continue down your current path. Here's the pleasure if you actually take action on it and what our solution can provide. And you still haven't talked about the solution. You're just talking about
Yeah.
them envisioning their life in hell, life in heaven, and the difference between those. That's the job of a marketer. And that means using your full arsenal of negative and positive stuff. Most companies and their brand guidelines lean heavily against using any negative stuff. Well, we don't badmouth competitors, or we don't even say anything negative about the client's current situation. Well, I'm like, you're a freaking idiot, because you can't convince anyone if they're
What's
okay
the
where
pain
they
point
are.
at that
Yeah.
at that
Yeah.
point? Yeah, like
Makes sense.
where's the
Yes.
agitation? Yeah.
Sorry to slow you down there, but I thought that was a really important one, that risk aversion, which in and of itself becomes a heavy risk for certain industries and certain clients if
Yeah,
it keeps them
yeah,
from making
it's
meaningful
true.
change.
And there's a couple more that I can think of off the top of my head. One is heavily regulated industries. It's really no fun to work in financial services or healthcare where they have a lot of, compliance issues, and there's always going to be that layer, and that's an appropriate level of risk aversion. You design the wrong medical device or make some misrepresentations about it, people will die. Okay, it's kind of
Yeah.
important. So even though we can help them, the process of helping them as an agency for us was not fun in highly regulated
Sure.
industries.
Yeah.
So something else that I've thought of. And then the opposite of that, which is um, when you get to a certain small scale, you have the one man or one person oompa band. It's like they're doing everything, that small company entrepreneur, and they don't have enough focus or resources to get anything done. So too big's a problem, too small is a problem. That Goldilocks zone again, where I aim my executive advisory of 10 to $100 million or 10 to $100 million division, that seems to be a pretty good place. Well, for me personally, I don't know what your services are.
Yeah, I mean, we see that as an actual pretty winning slot as well. I mean, just in terms of being able to see impact from making improvements, like, being able to
Readiness
make,
to adapt and
yeah.
Having enough arms and legs to implement, having budget,
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
of that
Yeah.
stuff, and yet not having that ossification, that the kind of sclerotic
Yeah.
enterprise level amount of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, we're not afraid of enterprise clients, but we just, they have all of those traits that you've met, or many of them
And you
do.
can
And
have that a
yeah.
division
Yeah.
within an
Yeah.
enterprise that does
And
function much more freely and
Yeah.
has leadership that has that kind of foresight and isn't bought into
Yeah.
the matrix, as I like to describe it.
Yeah.
That's certainly possible, but if you're trying to work on an enterprise level, you can't get in there anyway because you're up against the McCann Ericksons. But whatever.
Yeah. But and also just you feel that inertia of, I mean, everything from complacency to the actual practical lock-in to different technology stacks and
Hmm.
infrastructure, data infrastructure. and then the inertia, whether you have good leadership or indifferent leadership, right?
Or
There's
some reorg
like,
happens and they don't care
or
about stuff.
reorg.
I'll work. We work with a Fortune 100 company. It shall remain nameless, and we redesigned one of their product websites, and it was annualized about 37 million a year impact from just this one product change for leads to their distributors. And then they had an internal reorg, and they go, well, we don't care about profits anymore. We care about raising our net promoter score by 2 points. It's
Oh
like,
boy.
okay, congrats. Yeah, we
Nice.
either have a higher net promoter score than actual money. And they're not mutually exclusive. I bet if they'd launched that website and kept it up, their net promoter score would have gone up too.
Yeah.
But that kind of silly reorg stuff happens within large enterprises all the time,
Yeah.
especially if they're conglomerates.
Yep.
That's talk about being mystified by metrics in that sense, right? Like if if your focus is on improving your net promoter score, your actual focus should be improve your user and
User
customer
experience.
experience,
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
like the
then
result. That's you're not talking about symptoms at that point, right? Like that is
yeah,
no,
yeah,
like that will go up if you provide a better experience and make your product and or
yeah.
service more
Very
More
accessible,
interesting.
accessible.
easier to
Exactly.
interact. Yeah, like
Yeah.
You're
it's
preaching to the choir, gentlemen.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, your point is
This
what
is
kind
why we
of
like this tribe right now.
sparked the thought, which is, I mean, I recently in a blog post said, if you allow your metrics and reports to become reified data, as if that's what you think is the reality rather than the story behind them, you're doomed to fail. You're not focusing on the right things, right? It's like,
Well, that's like that Zen koan, it's like the don't confuse the finger for the moon. You're pointing at the moon, but you're focused on your finger.
yeah, for sure. No, absolutely. Uh,
So
you, oh, go ahead,
shifting
Sean.
gears a little bit here, just because we do have limited time with you, Tim. And I do want to promote your book a little bit. We've talked a lot about the concepts in it, but I thought there was some interesting pieces there. I think you make some pretty like actionable, digestible ways to improve, like for self improvement and just more awareness. And you talk about self care, and I think this is interesting. We live in a time it's become more. It's more in the zeitgeist, I guess. Like self care is hot right now. But as someone who's been you're an entrepreneur. You've started an agency. Like you've gone through a lot of these pain points that a lot of us experience. You've been in the weeds on marketing campaigns. What are some practical ways or some emphases that you have um, in making time for that? Why it's important? How it can help people become better leaders, better thinkers, more strategic. I'd love to kind of hear that from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I think you're referring to my latest book, Unleash Your Primal
Yes.
Brain, Demystifying How We Think and Why We Act. And it's written, it's funny because I was going to write it as a neuromarketing book. Here's the basics of evolutionary psychology. Here's how you apply it to marketing. I decided not to do that part, the second part. This is just a really readable overview of evolutionary psychology. So it can be applied to personal development, like you're asking me about, or sales, marketing, leadership, or it can be applied to, well, marketing specifically and things like that. So whatever lens you read it with, it'll work because it's basically describing the operating system for all human beings and what we picked up along the way in the arc of evolution. But specifically, if you're talking about being more personally effective, the by far the number one thing I can recommend is, well, proper sleep hygiene. Sleep is not optional. It's daily life support. Every form of life on this planet lives longer than about 5 days, has some form of sleep. So it's just, if you think you can be part of the 4 a.m. club, well, that's great if you're going to bed at 8 a.m. I mean, 8 p.m. and getting a full
Yeah,
8 hours
yeah,
of sleep. Okay, you need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And if you cheat yourself, like a couple of nights of short sleep, just down to 6 hours in a row, is the same as missing a full night of sleep.
Yeah, you're drawing
okay,
from a bank at that point, right?
Yeah,
It's
no, I did. And the thing that sleep does is it improves creativity. It improves any skills you practice, whether they're mental or physical.
okay,
It won't work without sleep happening. And it recalibrates, and this is the most important thing from high functioning people. It recalibrates our social connections because if you don't get proper sleep, what you think is that people are more set against you. You become more paranoid and aggressive. You misread people's micro expressions. It's really a lot of horrible outcomes happen. So if you're cheating sleep, you're shortening your life and destroying your social relationships.
Interesting.
It's that simple. So the number one thing you need is a consistent go to bed time, and the second thing you need is 7 to 9 hours of in an uninterrupted environment so you can get the proper amount of sleep, especially REM sleep, which is tail weighted to the last 90-minute
Yep.
cycle of the night. So
Amazing.
that
Great.
goes diet, exercise, all that other stuff layers on top of it is actually impossible without proper sleep. Is the habits of eating bad stuff or not exercising come out of improper sleep. In fact, here, I'll leave you with one final thought on sleep and how important it is. There is no major psychiatric condition that is actually that doesn't involve a sleep disturbance.
I believe that. I definitely believe that. Interesting. Tim, uh, let me say personally, uh, we want to be respectful of your time, and we're so appreciative of all of the insights you provided today. But I also want to ask if people want to hear more from you and want to have a conversation with you or to enlist your advisory services, how can they reach you?
Well, if you're interested primarily in the book, then you can go to primalbrain.com. It's also available on Amazon, Audible. It's been translated in the Chinese, Brazilian, Portuguese, Russian. You can find it pretty much anywhere books are sold. And if you're interested in my executive advisory or public speaking, then just go to timash.com, timash.com.
Perfect. And this has been such an awesome conversation. We appreciate the authentic voice. We appreciate your. I think if we were going to use an adjective to describe you,
Oh
I
yeah,
think
come up
direct.
with three. I'm curious.
I think direct, intelligent, and caring would be the three I would come up with.
Thank you.
And I just hope we can find another opportunity to connect and have you back on the podcast or a conversation around a fireside chat or an in-person event or some other way our paths cross again because this has been a pleasure.
Happy to do that. I would look forward to it.
Awesome.
Echo that sentiment. Always fun talking to you. You every time the few times I've gotten to talk to you, that passion and the caring shows, and it gets me caring more about things. So, uh, thank you, Tim, for making time for us. It really is appreciated.
It was my pleasure, definitely.
All right. Well, take care and enjoy the rest of your day and cross paths again soon.
Bye, Tim.